Clear prop.
Star 73, Yankee number 2, following twin traffic, 3 mile final, clear Pleasantville. 1 Charlie Bravo, exit in runway 25, going 4 mile final.
This is Behind the Prop with United Flight Systems owner and licensed pilot Bobby Doss and his co-host, Major Airline Captain and designated pilot examiner Wally Mulhern. Now let's go Behind the Prop.
What's up, Wally?
Hey, Bobby, how are you?
I am fantastic as always. This week we're going to address some topics about check rides. We're going to call this show Go Oriented on your check ride day. As a guy who owns a fly school and does about 25 check rides a month for my school, we obviously have a lot going on. Many days, this week included, we had one day with 5 check rides and another day with 3 check rides. Those are obviously hectic days, and we always have our fingers crossed for good weather, but it doesn't always happen. Sometimes I get a call as much as a week in advance. Wally, you as a DPE, I'm sure you've had a lot of funny phone calls with, hey, what do you think about the weather, Mr. DPE? And what's your initial gut, Wally, if you got that message 3 days early?
3 days early, I just, I'm not even thinking about this check ride 3 days early because I probably have 4 before then. Weather is so finicky everywhere. I will get calls from people a week out say, "Oh, it's supposed to be raining a week from tomorrow. What are we going to do about the check ride?" And I say, "Look, when we're within 12 hours of the check ride, let's have this conversation." But certainly not a week out.
Yeah, and I think there's some guidance for DPEs. We've talked about it, right? You have to you have to have intent to complete the check ride, I think is the way the regulation reads. Right.
And a lot of times people will say to me, "Well, yeah, we're not going to be able to fly. We'll just do the oral today." And I'll say, that doesn't work. I can't do that. So we got to have the intent to be able to fly. Obviously the easiest thing to look at is the forecast. All right, at XYZ time tomorrow, when we expect to fly, what is the forecast? Are we going to be able to fly under these conditions? And then what I will do is I will compare the forecast to the current conditions. So in other words, let's say it's 7 in the morning. We're doing an 8 a.m. check ride, and we expect to be in the air by about 10. Okay. I'll say, okay, well, at 10 o'clock, the forecast says 2,000 broken. Okay, well, the forecast for 7 a.m. was 1,000 overcast. But in fact, at 7 a.m., it's actually 2,000 overcast. So I will look at that and I'll say, okay, well, the weather right now is better than forecast. So I'll interpret it and say, okay, I'm expecting the weather probably to be better than forecast at 10 a.m. If it's better than forecast at 7 a.m., probably, and you got to look at frontal activity. There's a whole lot of parts to the weather equation. It's not just simply looking at what the forecast is or the trends, that kind of thing. You got to use some common sense. You got to say, hey, we're expecting a frontal passage, and the winds are going to shift, the temperature is going to go down, and so we do have to use some logic other than just looking at forecasts.
Well, in the same regard, I've also been around. I don't have a specific example, but I know I've been here while an oral has started with thunderstorms happening. And that's another forecastable decision, right? A squall line can move through at 8 a.m., and it can be a crystal clear day in Houston, Texas by 8:30 a.m., right? So absolutely. It's not just and what I try to tell applicants all the time when they're talking to me, and probably way before they want to talk to you, but the concern shouldn't be a concern until you have to make that decision. And that's 8 a.m. if my check ride starts at 8 a.m. There's logic where you can say, yeah, it's going to be a 700 overcast, low IFR, and a private's not going to fly, you maybe have a night before conversation, but you still probably don't cancel. You still want to have that go-oriented mindset that things can change. I want to keep my options open. It just is so painful if we at this school lose 4 or 5 check rides because of weather, because we still have 4 or 5 more check rides to do, which just I would never push or twist someone's arm to go when they don't want to go. But, man, let's stay positive and do everything we can within reason.
Yeah. And I have people right now asking me for check rides two weeks out, and I'm telling them right now is, look, I'm trying to clean up a mess from a week ago where I lost 3, and those people, I do give them priority. I finish the first people before I start new people. So, and they understand that, and they're appreciative of it because they're going to get that same special treatment, at least with me. And I don't know how other people handle it. That's one reason why I don't schedule 6 weeks out. My logic, my thought process is I don't schedule more than about 2 weeks out. That way, if I start one today and I can't finish, I'm able to get this person back in probably about 2 weeks or so, rather than saying, well, I'm booked through December, it'll be January. And then you start worrying about the 60-day issue, and maybe I've got a business trip planned, and it can be a mess. So that's my logic.
Yeah, it makes sense. And we're pretty involved with one another. It seems to work out really, really well. How many, and this is something that just came to mind, how many people text you 2-3 days in advance worrying about the weather and nothing ever ends up happening, and then they start the check ride and they're woefully unprepared? Meaning, how many people worry about the weather more than they worry about being prepared for their said check ride? You ever seen that happen?
Yeah. Oh yeah, that happens, and sometimes you just get a feeling that they're looking for a reason to cancel the check ride, and if that's the case, I would much rather them just come out and say, hey, I'm not where I want to be. I'm not going to be able to do this check ride 3 days from now, because trust me, I've got a list as long as my arm of people that I can call and probably fill that spot within 3 days.
Yeah, hopefully my school's at the top of that list. But I read an article in Flight Training Magazine from the AOPA recently, and the quote in the big sidebar says, on check ride day, there are so many things to worry about, like your level of preparation or enough fuel in the tanks, things that are well within your span of control. The weather, however, is not one of them. And so I think if you're an applicant and you're out there and you're really hyped up about the weather, maybe you should go check your check ride notebook or your preparation and make sure your really A game is on for the check ride. Being a weatherman trying to predict what's going to happen is probably not the most important thing for you as the applicant, for sure.
Yeah, I remember flying an airline flight many years ago, and we had come in and our gate was occupied. Most people have probably been in the back of airplanes when the gate's occupied, and so we're sitting out there with an engine running, waiting for a gate, and of course we make a call and try to, of course we're thinking about us and only us and saying, well, gee, there's an empty gate. Why can't we have that gate? Well, of course, there's a big picture going on with the airline operation. There might be 50 gates at an airport, and not all the gates can accommodate all airplane sizes. So they got to, it's like a house of cards that they have to build to get all the airplanes into the gate. And I just remember my first officer looking over at me saying, and he was wrapped around. He was going crazy that we didn't have a gate, and I'm just sitting there relaxed. And he said to me, boy, when I get to be a captain, I hope I can have your mindset, your attitude. And I said, what do you mean? He says, well, this doesn't seem to be upsetting you. And I said, there's nothing I can do about it. I said, if it's not within my control or my influence, would be a better way of saying it. If it's not within something that I can influence, it's not worth me getting excited over. And I try to live life that way. Now, granted, I mean, when my team is not winning the game and I'm sitting at home on the couch, there's not much I can do about it. I do get excited over that, so I need to listen to my own advice sometimes. But like you said, you can't control the weather, but you do know what your limitations are. If, geez, I don't want to fly with wind gusting to 15 knots. Okay, well, if the wind is gusting to 15 right now and it's forecast to be gusting to 25, well, maybe you shouldn't fly.
Yeah, and everybody's going to probably have a differing opinion on this. I have mine, and I'm happy to share. But what if at 8 a.m. you're starting this check ride, and the winds are forecast to be 10 knots right across the runway? Is that the time to cancel the flight portion that's set to probably start around 10 a.m.? What are your feelings on that?
No. I'd say, let's.
But my personal minimums are 9. What if my personal minimums were 9, and it's still forecast to be 10 at 10 a.m.?
Well, let's wait till 10 a.m. and see what it is.
Exactly.
Because it may be 8. It may be 8.
It may be 5, right? It may change directions and be right down the runway.
And we do have
a lot
some
of short-sightedness.
We do have some flexibility in how we can conduct the check ride as well. Let's say on a private and commercial, the landings are a part of the check ride. There's going to be a cross-country element. There's going to be some high work. There's going to be some ground reference maneuvers. So think of it as four different sections of the check ride. Typically I start out with a cross-country phase, and depending on airports, sometimes we'll do the landings at another airport, and then we'll do the high work. And then the low work, and then come back in. Or sometimes it's the cross-country phase, it's the high and low work, and then come back in and do the landings. But we can start with the landings. So there could be a day where it's 1,800 broken to start with. Maybe a private pilot check ride, 1,800 broken. We could start. We could do the landings. Landings are going to take probably... by the time we pre-flight and taxi out and all that stuff, that's probably close to an hour. Maybe 30 minutes on the ground and 30 minutes worth of landings. If it's maybe by the time we're ready to go out and do the cross-country phase of the check ride, it's gone from 1,800 broken to 2,600 scattered. Okay, we can work with that. We can do the check ride. So, and I'm willing to adjust my profile on how we're going to do things based on weather, because the examiner wants to get it done as well.
No question. Yeah. Maybe sometimes more than the student does, right? Or the applicant does.
Yeah.
The other thing I was going to say that you maybe just think about was, and I just know how you normally do it, not the other DPs in this area, but if you're going to do 2 in a day, you're going to schedule one at 8 a.m. and one at 1 p.m. And in Texas, about 9 months out of the year, it gets dark at 8 p.m. If the forecast is proactively changing for the better, are you willing to take lunch at 10:15 or 10:30 or adjust some of those windows of time in real time?
Absolutely, yeah. And we do it all the time. And then there are many, many days where I don't take a lunch. You just the number 2 guy, or the number 2 girl, the number 2 check ride says, "Hey, I'm gonna chew on some food while we're getting this first, or we're checking all your paperwork." And nobody has ever objected to that.
Yeah, of course. We want to be go oriented. We want to get this stuff done and move on.
Yeah.
So that's all good stuff. We were talking a little bit before of the recent thing that happened on a check ride, and you did some math. Talk a little bit about your decision or mindset, maybe new thoughts on what should happen with the gear up on a multi-engine check ride.
Yeah, there's I obviously do a lot of multi-engine check rides, and I do a lot of MEI check rides as well. And I always ask an applicant, at what point are they going to raise the gear? And the stock answer I get is when we're out of available runway length. And I go, okay. I say, have you ever applied any math or science to that? And they go, they'll usually say, well, no. And I'll say, well, how do you determine when we're out of available runway length? And usually what it comes down to is, well, I just kind of look out the window. And so if you were to take your airplane, your multi-engine airplane, and let's use use the runway length at your local airport, whatever it happens to be. And what I'll use 5,000 feet, because we have a lot of our satellite airports that we use for a lot of landings that have 5,000 foot long runways. And I'll say, okay, let's take our takeoff distance in our multi-engine airplane, and then let's take our landing distance in our multi-engine airplane and subtract it from 5,000 feet. Okay, so now we may only have 2,000 feet left. Let's just say, and I'm just using big, nice round numbers. Let's say takeoff distance is 1,800 feet and landing distance is 1,200 feet. That's a total of 3,000 feet. So to actually take off and then to land on a given piece of concrete, we need 3,000 feet. So now we have 2,000 feet left. And that's not even accounting for taking off yet. So now we figure out what our takeoff speed is, and we convert it to miles per hour, and we convert that to feet per second, and then we figure out what our climb rate is. And by and large, at about 200 feet in most airplanes, on a 5,000-foot runway, you're out of runway. In other words, we have enough runway to take off, get to about 2,000 feet, and I use a 2-second reaction time because usually most airplanes, you're doing about 130 feet per second across the ground. And so you take off at about 200 feet, you have something go wrong, usually an engine failure. You decide to put it back down on the runway. You're probably out of runway. And what I see with a lot of people on multi-engine airplanes, we're not raising the gear until about 500 or 600 feet above the ground. And so, in a multi-engine airplane, when you lose an engine, you want to do two things. You want to increase power and reduce drag. And it takes a little bit of time to get that gear up sometimes. So if that gear can already be up, you've already reduced the drag. So just a thought. And I'm not saying when you're out of available runway is the wrong way to go about things. I think where this has come from is single-engine complex airplanes. We take off in a single-engine complex airplane, and the philosophy has been keep the gear down until we are positive that we can't put the airplane down anymore. Because in a single-engine airplane, when we lose an engine, we don't have any options. The airplane's coming down, so we'd rather have the gear down. And if we can put it on the runway, that's great. A multi-engine airplane, you have options. We can maybe keep flying, or at least descend at a reduced rate. So we may be at a high.
It's an interesting topic.
Yeah. So you can do all kinds of conversions again, figure out feet per second and climb rate. How many? If we're going up at 600 feet per minute, that's 10 feet per second. And you can figure out, so that's 20 seconds to get to 200 feet. And
it's not going to be much, even at this runway, 7,000 feet runway. You're gonna be making. If you're making it visually, it's a different story. But if you do put some math behind it, you're not going to be that high when you really are no longer going to be able to land, for sure.
Right. So I don't know. Might be a different philosophy to say positive rate gear up. That's the way bigger airplanes do it. And I'm not saying a Piper Seminole or a Baron or something is a bigger airplane, but I think we really ought to look at how much runway it would really take in an airplane to take off to get to 500 feet, have about a 2-second pause, reaction time that, oh my gosh, what just happened, and then descend at X amount of feet per minute and figure out how much distance it really takes to do that. And I think you'd be surprised at how much distance it takes. It's probably a lot more than what your typical runway length is.
Yeah, for sure. So that's another good example of just a little tip on a check ride. What about, again, being go-oriented? We've experienced something this week, and I bet other schools are experiencing it around the country. What if IACRA's not doing what we want it to do, Wally? Is the day doomed? Are we doomed? Is it over?
It's not, and we do have the option to do a paper application. Now, does the hassle factor go up immensely on a paper application? It absolutely does, and the whole process is slowed down. But if IACRA is down, and some examiners will not do a paper application. I don't like doing them. I do maybe about 2 a year. And, something that you do twice a year, you're usually not very good at. And so when you do a paper application with IACRA, there are, or a paper application without IACRA, I should say, there are a lot of potential errors. So one thing that I like to do is have the applicant come. When you go in to IACRA, when IACRA goes down, it's usually for about a couple hour time frame, and we usually know about it. And typically it goes down at 8 o'clock Central Time, and they say it's going to be down for about an hour or so. And whenever I have check rides on those days, I always get in touch with the applicant, and I say, hey, IACRA is supposed to go down at 8 a.m., so let's start at 7:30 tomorrow morning. And they've always been accommodating. We get into IACRA well before 8 a.m. and take care of all the IACRA stuff so that we are logged in. They have signed the application. Then IACRA goes down. While we're doing the ground, we go out and fly, and usually by the time we come back, it's back up. So it's a non-event if you plan for it. But occasionally there are times where there are certain situations where IACRA does funny things with certain check rides. Certain check rides you cannot do in IACRA. And I won't get into all that, but the only option is a paper application. It's not something I would prefer to do, just because there are a lot of things within IACRA that we'll kind of check, and when we do the paper, you're having to check it manually, and when it gets to Oklahoma City, the rejection rate of paper applications is much higher than of IACRA applications. But it is,
yeah. And
it
so
is
if it's
doable.
down, how does someone get a certificate? Like if it's down, what happens with the certificate piece?
Yeah, I think what most of us have is we have printable PDFs that we, or fillable PDFs that we're able to fill in all the information. And so the temporary certificate that I will issue when IACRA is down is it's typed and it looks nice, and probably doesn't look a whole lot different than the IACRA generated certificate that you get. And then I have to email the application, that certificate, and the knowledge test results. If this particular check ride had knowledge test results, all that has to be emailed into the FAA, which the examiner will take care of. But with that in mind, when you do fill out your application in IACRA, just print, make a paper copy of your application. So if the morning or the afternoon of the check ride, boom, IACRA is down and we weren't expecting it, you've got the application sitting right there and it's ready to go.
Such an easy thing to do that could save a whole lot of heartache, and is the epitome of being go oriented for sure.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little. Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, my first flying job I had was at a FBO that did charter and flight instruction, and my boss, a guy named Eric Mingeldorf. I don't know if he listens to the show. It'd be great if he did, but he used to use that phrase all the time: go oriented. In the charter business, we are in the business of moving people around. And I will say this: I never, ever, ever felt pressured into taking a flight that was unsafe. But on the other hand, people are buying a service, and they are asking us to fly them from here to there. And we need to try to make that happen.
Yeah, it's a good mindset to have, as long as it's not a negative mindset that means, hey, I'm able to fly in this low IFR. I'm being go oriented. That's not what we're talking about. It's right. Doing it safely and without risk.
Yeah, we actually had a young man that sent in a question, and he asked about being pressured into taking a flight, and I've got to say, I've really only worked for 3 aviation companies in my life: this first FBO, my commuter airline, and my current airline. And in my career, I can honestly say I have never been pressured into taking a flight that I felt was unsafe. Never, whether it be mechanically or weather related. It's hard for me to imagine working for a company where that happens. Now I know it happens, but I can't say I've ever experienced it.
Yeah, I've heard a few stories, but they're stories and maybe a little blown out of proportion. But that's definitely not what we're talking about here. And as we transition to the next topic, it really is about squawks and things that could be anomalies on aircraft, and just what some applicants might do to want to scrub the flight or not go or not be go oriented, right? Again, not safety stuff here. We're talking about, I've seen somebody come in demanding that I change a nav light for a 10, for a AM check ride on a private check ride. And I challenged that a little bit. Like, we're not going to take the plane out of service and send it to the mechanic and let the mechanic put a green nav light in there for a daytime flight. What are your thoughts on, and have you got any good stories on some crazy squawk conversations around the check ride?
Yeah, that's the airplane needs to be legal, and as part of the qualifying the airplane, we talked about this a few episodes. The examiner has to be legal, the applicant has to be legal, and the airplane has to be legal. I will ask them if everything in the airplane works, and hopefully the answer is yes. And if the answer is no, then we'll dig into making sure that it has been properly disabled and logged accordingly. But I'm fine with going with something that is not working, as long as we've done what we need to do. If it's a day flight and a nav light is in op, okay, well, let's placard it in op. Let's make sure it's in the logbook, and let's take care of that. But, we do have the ability to go with inoperative equipment if it's properly taken care of.
Yeah, can you imagine if you told your company we're not going because the coffee pot's broken?
Yeah. No, I can't, actually. Yeah.
That wouldn't go over very well, I don't think. Right? And I think there's some things that sound shocking that I've experienced. I've experienced some of it with you, right? What if you get out there to the plane, the applicant turns the master switch on to check the lights and the flaps, and everything seems to be working fine, but the engine won't turn over when they go to start it, and they assume that it's electrical. Is that a reason to cancel the check ride?
No, I mean, it's just like your car. I mean, what are you going to do if you go out to start your car and your car doesn't start? Well, you might think about jumping it off. And
we
that with airplanes.
Jump planes for sure.
Right.
And
right.
It doesn't necessarily always indicate something's wrong with the plane. The pilot right before you could have left the master switch off or on all night long, which happens at flight schools, unfortunately. And a jump is not that big of a deal. I think as a young pilot, had it been my private check ride, I would have been freaking out if the flight school would have said, well, I will just jump it. But it was my lack of knowledge and my lack of experience that would have created that for me.
Right.
Man, there's all kinds of tips to take some of that stress off, right? Calling for fuel or making sure there's fuel. Have you ever spent any time waiting for fuel, Wally, for a flight?
Oh, there's two things that I seem to wait for a lot at flight schools, and that's to use the restroom, because most of the flight schools only have one restroom. That seems to be the norm, and the other is waiting for fuel. And I get frustrated when the applicant does a 30-minute pre-flight and the last thing they do is check the fuel. I would think maybe the first thing that we would do is check the fuel. So while we're looking at the tail and looking at the tires, that fuel truck can be on the way. So, at my airline, we used to say comforts and quantities. When you get to the airplane, the first thing we want to do is check comforts and quantities. In other words, if we need to get air conditioning or heat on the airplane, let's do that right now. And of course, in smaller airplanes, that's really not a factor. But quantities, if we, in the big airplanes, we're looking at oil, we're looking at oxygen, we're certainly looking at fuel, wastewater, emptied, potable water, all these quantities that if we need to address it, let's address it 30 minutes before the flight rather than 1 minute before the flight, which will cause a delay.
Yeah, all really good tips for sure. One thing we missed in my notes here on the jumping the aircraft, if you've never been involved with jumping an aircraft, Wally, what would be the step you would take? I mean, we're going to get the flight school involved, but as pilot in command, what's the first thing you're going to do or turn to jump that aircraft?
First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look in the POH, and there is there will be a procedure for starting the airplane using external power, is usually what it's called. And the big thing about that is in most airplanes, you're going to start the airplane with the master switch off. So it's a big deal. It's just the way the external power receptacle, where it's wired into the system, that once it's plugged in, you're going to get power to the airplane. So you're going to be sitting in the airplane and things are going to light up and the master switch is off. Now, are all airplanes that way? I don't know. I can't speak for, say, a Cirrus. I've never done it in a Cirrus. But I know Pipers, I've jump-started my Saratoga before, and the procedure is for the master switch to be off. So just like anything else, anytime you're doing a procedure that is not normal, you should pull out the checklist and follow it accordingly. Manual gear extension. If you're ever going to extend the gear manually, pull out the checklist.
Yeah, it's all good stuff. And I think the theme and the title today is be go-oriented, right? We want to get these check rides done. We want to do them safely, but a lot of the little things that I've seen, and maybe some big things that aren't as big as we all think they might have been, that prevent check rides from happening can be solved. Get the flight school, get the aircraft operator involved, take time to try and investigate and troubleshoot and see if you can't be go-oriented and get off the ground and make that day one of the most important days of your life. No matter how you do it safely and stay behind the prop.
Thanks for checking out the Behind the Prop podcast. Be sure to click subscribe and check us out online at BehindTheProp.com. Behind the Prop is recorded in Houston, Texas. Creator and host is Bobby Doss. Co-host is Wally Mulhern. The show is for entertainment purposes only and is not meant to replace actual flight instruction. Thanks for listening, and remember, fly safe.